Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin. We have a tremendous show for you this week, our 44th episode. We are coming at you here in the middle of September 2023. Putin's meeting with Kim Jong-un. Shoigu is responding to strikes in Crimea. We're getting interviews with potential future czars. Armenia and Azerbaijan are about to go to war. We're recording this hoping that by the time you're listening to this, the major invasion hasn't happened and everything we're going to say is irrelevant. But even if that does happen, it won't be irrelevant because I have a feeling we're going to be pretty spot on. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. Exciting episode, lots to speak about, and it does kind of flow very smoothly from last week's episode into this one. And some new events I think occurring around the world. Definitely, we'll be touching on the Balkans, Yugoslavia. Again, some fresh news out of Africa, and yeah, just developments in Europe. Again, we're moving. Unironically, and not to make it a cliche, but some of the statements from Shoigu and some of the actions by the Ukraine are seemingly inching us towards like a third world war conflict, or at least attempting to agitate the Russian side to the point where Russia would need to retaliate with some sort of with a strike we haven't seen before. And so we'll definitely be talking about all of that. And speaking of strikes, I think it's worth starting with the great meeting of the great meeting of our glorious leaders in of Eurasia, which is Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, which occurred in the east at Vladivostok earlier this week.
Yeah, we're going to hop right into that. And it's always funny when these things go on with Kim Jong-un. Russia and China, they're like the only countries that like treat him like a normal person. And so it's kind of jarring to see the like Kim Jong-un, with the normal photo shoots sitting in the chairs like the Prime Minister of the UK would when he visits Washington D.C. or something, in any kind of Russian setting. I mean, we know he was even there for when Putin accepted Donetsk and Luhansk into the Russian Federation. So he's quite familiar with the getting a warm welcome in Russia. So it's always interesting to see. Of course, we don't know exactly what Putin and Kim discussed, but rumors are flowing around that they could be securing millions and millions of shells because North Korea has some of the highest output of ammunition and just general weapons production just per capita of any country, especially compared to any individual Western country. So, I mean, we always hear from the West that, well, maybe the Russians are doing okay and they've admitted the Ukrainian counteroffensive is failing, but they are running out of ammo just like everybody else. But, well, if what we think is going to happen right now with Kim Jong-un is happening, I don't think that's going to be a problem for much longer. And there's even potential for much greater, collaboration beyond just ammunition sharing. Dmitry, what are you thinking could be in the works?
Yeah, I think the subject of ammunition is definitely a hot topic, and most people really don't understand. And I myself was not quite clear until the SMO exactly how much ammunition modern warfare would use up per day, and until Prigozhin released those videos where he claimed at Bakhmut the Russian side would shoot up to 10,000, maybe more shells in one day. Like those are staggering numbers in one particular territory over Bakhmut and Soledar in the span of 24 hours. That's insane. And so when we're speaking about millions and hundreds of thousands of shells, that's exactly what the Russian side needs at the moment, because of course at the moment it's primarily artillery-based warfare. What we're seeing is two sides lobbing long-range artillery shells at one another, and of course the tank warfare is also present, but that's kind of minimized. In fact, you may not even see a battle between tanks if you're on the front lines sitting in the trenches, either on the Ukrainian or the Russian side. But nevertheless, North Korea has been militarized against the South, and they've had this armistice for a very long time now, close to closing in on 70 years. So, of course, North Korea has produced and probably amassed so many shells that are just lying there in storage. And I'm not sure if there are expiry dates on these things, but definitely, if this is what Russia wishes to acquire, I think it would be a great idea to purchase them. And North Korea isn't the richest country around, so frankly, you could even have trades for various things. Again, we've discussed the fact that North Korean laborers were actually they were organized. Remember last year in September when Kim Jong Un first, I think it was. No, it was actually early in 2022 when Kim Jong-un first visited Russia since the SMO. There were these organized laborers who would come to Donetsk and Lugansk to actually rebuild it. So there were collaborations in the past of actually bringing in military personnel from North Korea to help rebuild the SMO zone, as you may call it. So, in fact, this discussion could have been, as we said, it's a speculation about what they spoke about, but it could have been about something such as simple, well, we need more police officers in the SMO zone, or we need more laborers, we need more blue collar workers to rebuild, cities such as Mariupol or Donetsk, Lugansk. or even to start building trenches or work on some of these dry docks, which they that are need rebuilding in Crimea. So it could be something as simple as that, or something as complex as it gets a little bit crazy, but North Korean mercenaries and North Korean like military personnel on the ground, boots on the ground in Ukraine, because as mentioned on the Duran show, there is nothing the West can actually do to respond to North Korean boots on the ground in the SMO zone. There is no escalation point from here. North Korea is already sanctioned to all hell. They're considered even more of I guess you can call it international globalist global rejects than Russia is, technically speaking. So there's really nothing they can do to punish North Korea for even sending troops to assist the Russian Federation, and Russia could really give a lot to North Korea for something like that. So I think I think the potential for collaboration is very broad here. It's just it comes down to exactly what Putin and Kim Jong Un spoke about, and it could be something as little and as insignificant as East Asian politics, right? Because we do know Kim Jong Un has been missile testing over Okinawa, over Japan, and really agitating the western side of the hemisphere, the Pacific Ocean, really kind of harassing, I guess, American influenced bases over there. So it could be something as simple as wartime diplomacy that they spoke about, frankly. And it did occur in Vladivostok, so, Putin, maybe perhaps the fact that Putin traveled across all of Russia to meet Kim Jong-un does show that maybe Putin was the one asking, right? He was like, okay, look, Kim, you don't have to travel 2,000, 3,000 kilometers to meet me. I'll come to you because I'm the one actually with the proposition here, and you just have to kind of lend me a hand here.
Yeah, I think for Putin, it's important that, I think we agreed on this show that he waited too long to even go to Donbass and some of these areas. At this point, he knows he has to make his presence known across the whole span of Russia. I mean, was it at the beginning of the SMO or before the SMO started? There was that kind of disruption out in the Far East when that supposed mayor, I guess, was going against Putin from the right. There's that whole thing out there. So he's trying to make sure that he, is a pan-Russian leader, geographically speaking. But when it comes to North Korea and Russia, I think you're totally right. And I agree with the Duran guys that the West isn't really a factor in that decision. I think it's entirely China. I think Kim feels emboldened and has been kind of allowed to push the limits with the missile tests and with that kind of stuff because of China, because of the US's increased pressure on Taiwan with the Pelosi visits, and Biden saying, I guess now, we're going to defend Taiwan militarily despite openly holding to the one China policy. Just check the US Embassy website. We hold to the one China policy. We believe Taiwan is part of China. But I think North Korea is given a lot of free rein to act in that part of the Pacific Ocean because China wants, to counter the U.S. China is doing their own things and surrounding Taiwan, and they're, shutting down, forcing the Taipei airport to shut down flights for hours due to missile tests and whatnot and defense exercises. So, they're putting the pressure on there. But in general, I think China is probably the only one holding back a full-on, North Korean presence within the special military operation because, they know that North Korea, while, Russia's now might be its closest ally. The perception and still understanding is that China is their closest ally, it's their longest border and all that. So they don't want to necessarily get dragged into something by proxy due to the North Koreans being involved. But, that may change. Maybe the Chinese see that as something that could develop positively. We don't really know. But in general, we know the Chinese are in general looking towards peace and trying to negotiate that as they've, been successful so far in the world of they're dipping their toe into international relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia, but it doesn't help the West if they want to keep China in that peaceful mindset. It doesn't help when they do these insane attacks on Crimea, which I want to get your take on, Dimitri.
Yeah, that's right. I think that strike on Crimea recently really sparked off a lot of alarm bells. I think not just in people, in minds of people who have been following geopolitics, but also because Crimea was for a really long time one of the official red lines that both Shoigu and Putin have mentioned. That look, Crimea is not technically a war zone. The Kerch Bridge, of course, which has been struck multiple times for various terrorist acts and Ukrainian drones. Yes, that's been quite bad. But now we have an official, Storm Shadow strike, which the Ukrainians have claimed. Yeah, it is a Storm Shadow missile, by the way, which of course is made in the UK. It's a British long-range missile, could be shot from a fighter plane over 150 kilometers away. So essentially very long range. The Russians really, unless they have perfectly positioned air defenses, they can't really stop it. In fact, so Storm Shadows are very fast, they're very accurate as well, which makes them incredibly dangerous. And basically, Sevastopol had a dry dock. They were fixing two Russian military ships, and the Storm Shadow missile hit right on target, and the two ships were damaged. Several civilians were hurt. I'm not sure if there were any actual losses, and of course, by civilians we mean like literal non-military laborers who are actually working on the dry dock ships. And for those of you not aware or maybe not familiar, dry docking is when the ship is actually lifted out of the sea or out of the water and essentially fixed on the hull is being worked on. So it's this has been done since ancient times when ancient Greeks would like roll up their ships out of the water. So dry docking is very common, and that's of course when the ship is most vulnerable, when the entire hull is exposed, and that's when the Storm Shadow missile actually hit its target. So we do recall Shoigu actually, his response was, and we recall his previous response in June 2023, where he openly says that, look, if there are any strikes upon Crimea, and this is of course the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Sergei Shoigu, saying this, not some level, not some communist or some irrelevant liberal politician in Russia who wants to gain clout in the parliament, but Shoigu just openly states, look, if there are any strikes on Crimea, we're going to be escalating the matter, and it will involve the United States and the UK. I believe that one, pretty much paraphrasing what he said, but that was the message back in June, and it seems that he has restated that now. And the Storm Shadow missile has occurred, right? So the strike has taken place. It's been confirmed. Ukraine has taken complete custody over the strike. So they've claimed that it was us. By the way, the UK has surprisingly kept silent. So, and it does remind me in a way. It is very again, it's reminiscent. Sadgrad actually had mentioned this. It was very reminiscent of the strikes that, say, the United Kingdom had over, say, Nazi Germany, where they would have these pinpoint strikes across the Nazi German docks over the course of World War II, right? Being kind of estranged on their little island of Albion for so long, and really not being involved in after 1941, not too intensely, besides Normandy and there's other invasions. But the analogy there is that the UK is, of course, assisting Ukraine in a very disconnected sense, but still, these Storm Shadow missiles, they are of their production. So, to what extent is Russia going to involve the UK? Will there be any responses? And this comes in the wake of course, Putin's press conference interview again, where he kind of openly says that, well, look, who actually controls UK foreign intelligence? Could it be the CIA? And he makes these strange, again, in a very Putin-like sense, these allusions to like, well, does the West actually control its own foreign policy, or maybe is Europe under the influence of America, or is America under the influence of Europe? Which is very, very well and good, but now that the red lines have been crossed, I'm just wondering what Russia will do next.
I think I'll just be frank about it. We're either gonna see in the next few weeks we're gonna have to see at least a very dramatic response, some kind of dramatic escalation, or hate to say it, there's weakness afoot, like if you're just gonna let these red lines get crossed and these things happen and then just release more and more strongly worded statements, eventually, the strongly worded statements aren't even going to seem particularly strongly worded. It's just going to seem like weakness. And of course, I mean, there's all sorts of things you could do to get back at the United Kingdom in this regard. And I mean, these days the UK is too busy being based banning American pit bulls. But if while they're distracted doing that, I think hopefully, you could do all sorts of things through, their influence in places like Poland, or their influence in places like the Balkans, and or their influence, in places like the Middle East. Like these are all, like with France as well. We know the Prigozhin thing. We've kind of fingered France on that. It seems that the Russians are willing to go against France, which frankly, if we're looking at which individual states Russians should be going up against, I would rather you be going against the UK and America and courting France and Germany. But it seems that, in many ways, Russia, you work with what you can get, and France, they're weak in Africa, so Russia's gonna take from them, right? It's kind of I say you take what you can get, not to disparage Russia, more to disparage France in that regard. But it does seem that, unfortunately, Russia isn't able to play it. Like, same with the Armenia-Azerbaijan situation, which we're going to get to in a little bit later on the show. Russia doesn't have the luxury of playing with its allies, like with its favorite people. Armenia betrayed them. All these other characters have, not played their part properly. Macron, not that France was their friend, but, Macron, despite wanting a multipolar, independent EU, he sees the only way to secure that is by being even more anti-Russian somehow. So yeah, I mean, there's going to have to be some kind of response. I mean, I obviously don't want any kind. I mean, I'm an Anglo myself. I don't want any kind of aggression on the Isles. But we know that with Scotland, I think Russia needs to put the pedal to the metal and get Scotland independent and break up the United Kingdom or something, or else these people aren't going to take you seriously.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's plenty of stuff that can be done in terms of like soft policy and just soft influence, which Russia, frankly, has had a weak take on, even in its neighboring Ukraine. Right? Yeah, how influential has Russia been since even before 2014 in Ukraine in terms of influencing its neighbor? Now, of course, those matters have been escalated in terms of promotion of foreign political ties to African countries, like you mentioned, France, and that does connect to the fact that Surovikin has been recently seen again, not somewhere in the Commonwealth of Independent States, right, where his position has been temporarily moved to, it seems, but he has been spotted in Algeria, which I think is a pretty strong statement considering Algeria has taken a really neutral stance on the whole ECOWAS Niger situation. So it does speak to the fact that the Russians are still very heavily involved in Africa, and the sort of the death of the Wagner leadership is alongside Prigozhin doesn't really stifle any of those efforts. And of course, now we know officially Yevkurov has been visiting Libya for the past 3 weeks. Again, we don't know what these Russian generals. The Yevkurov, of course, was deputy defense minister of Russia. We don't know what these generals are speaking about to the local Muslim North African leadership. Again, it's similar to Putin and Kim Jong Un. Like of course, the private conversations are not recorded. Even say some of the agreements or those documents which are signed between the two between these various leaders, they're not exactly made public, but we do understand even, say, Surovikin, actually the General Armageddon showing up in Algeria will in fact trigger responses in the West. There'll be articles written up, there'll be people will have to somehow make an analytical statement on that particular his particular presence there. Like, what will this mean for Algeria? And you mentioned in the past, like, Algeria has been one of the more strongly Muslim countries. Like, they do have a very particular foreign political stance, and as well as domestically, they are seemingly conservative from a Muslim perspective. And it ties into the fact that Surovikin is seen in Algeria visiting one of their local mosques as well. So that was kind of a place of diplomacy where friends could speak in private, and it's just raising tensions for the West and raising tensions for the EU. Again, Russia is not leaving Africa, and nor should it, frankly. Think about it this way: if NATO is not leaving the Caucasus and not leaving Central Asia, continuing to have a presence all around the former Commonwealth of Independent States, so, I mean, not former, but I guess the former Soviet Union, and even in the Balkans, Russia should, in fact, push itself into, I guess, spheres of Western influence, which would be North Africa, and make a presence there. And in fact, all of these agreements, these are speaking to various leaders of the Muslim and, I guess, African leaders in the area. It's there's a mutual gain to be had there. So the Africans and the Muslims do have things that they can pick up from Russia, and Russia could have what could obtain things from them too. So in fact, it's not just a one-sided relationship there, and it isn't just Russia abusing African or Muslim third world countries. No, it's simply Russia has something to give, and the Muslims have something to return.
Well, it's important to remember Algeria is one, possibly the number one geopolitical. If there's one country that aligns itself against Israel, it's Algeria. And Algeria also rejected France's request to basically use their airspace to run operations on Niger, which Algeria shares a huge border with Niger. And of course, Morocco, who used to kind of be buddy buddy with, not buddy buddy, but they used to be kind of one mind on foreign policy regarding the Middle East and Israel with Algeria. They basically totally reproached with the West. They basically got their Western Sahara for those of you that looked at a map that was made a few years ago, Western Sahara was always this independent territory disputed. It's now been totally given to Morocco, and Morocco had allowed France to run, anti-Niger junta operations through its airspace, despite not even sharing a border with Niger. And the whole ECOWAS thing is, still very much in flux. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have taken very dramatic steps against all French power blocks, whether it's the embassy itself or any kind of lingering troops within their countries. Those have all been expelled or threatened to be, kicked out by force. And it does seem that, there were rumors that when Surovikin, got moved to his, kind of weird CIS air defense post, that maybe it's kind of a holding position for him to become the head of some new and improved, totally incorporated Wagner PMC. And maybe that's on the horizon, and we're waiting for it. But it does seem that Africa, the Russians had a few cards out, and the African part of their African hand they were playing seems to have come back well. So it would make sense that they're going to keep doubling down. But that spreads across Sudan. All that stuff is still going on. People in the West, it's not as exciting of a news cycle to just cover the random updates of, African territorial inter-junta conflicts, but those things are always dynamic and changing every day. But unless you have anything else you want to say about North Korea, Surovikin, Shoigu, and the Ukraine situation, we want to get into the church persecutions.
Yeah, the only thing I have to say about North Korea is that Russia did in fact show a very respectful hand. So if the agreement between North Korea and Russia does develop into something extremely pro-Russian, if we do see North Korean troops on the ground, don't be surprised. Frankly, the fact that Shoigu himself, and mind you, North Korea is a very militarized society, so the fact that Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, not Lavrov, not like an Anthony Blinken type character, goes over to North Korea, the North Koreans will take it up as a sign of respect. Like, look, you have I guess your top guy, your top warlord, Sergei Shoigu, actually visiting us, and of course he was there for the parade for the war anniversary for the ending, so the victory of the North Korean war over the South. And that was a big deal in July, and that's probably when they could have planned this meeting between Putin and Kim Jong Un, which I guess the outcome of which we'll find out soon. So I think that was the big precursor. Whether or not we'll come up with anything, I guess we'll see. And and you mentioned how America kind of enabled all this, especially under the Biden administration, under the Trump's administration, when Trump would meet with Kim Jong Un, and there was actually some closure there. This wouldn't have been possible, right? Or at least this sort of buddy friendship type thing between North Korea and Russia would not have been as explicit and as painful for the United States and even Western nations around the world. So I think the Biden administration is explicitly to blame. And I mean, CEO of McDonald's diplomacy between Anthony Blinken and some of the Ukrainian. I mean, Anthony Blinken traveling to China, telling them that, look, we always considered Taiwan to be a part of, a part of China historically, and it's just like. So on one side, Biden agitates China and shows weakness. On the other hand, you have Anthony Blinken completely supporting them. It's a very weak position. The entire Biden administration has failed American foreign policy very, very drastically, both in Europe and in Asia. So let's not be surprised that North Korea finally has, I guess, has the gonads in order to directly travel to Russia and now possibly even assist them in a military sense, which is absolutely, it would seem completely insane 5 years ago, but now that's the reality we live in. So I think with that being said, we'll have to wait until next week until we actually get some news regarding this. But yeah, definitely a hot subject.
Yeah, I mean, Kim Jong-un, he's always a character. The news likes to cover him. They think he looks funny, so they like taking pictures of him. But, I think I respect him. If he wants to come on the show, we'll have him on. I know Koreans, we can make it work, right? But you talked about Putin and all of that. I want to briefly mention before you talk about the persecutions, Putin, very explicitly, he doesn't get too explicit about American politics too often, but he very explicitly, called out the U.S. for their political persecution of Trump and said for him, it's a good thing that it just lays bare the hypocrisy of the West and that they have no right to claim, that countries they don't like happen to be using their rhetoric. They're treading on the rule of law. The justice system there isn't fair. It's anti-democratic. All the nonsense. NGO, CIA talking points you hear about regime change. He was saying the persecution of Trump just totally lays bare the hypocrisy of the U.S. and that they're just as oligarchic of a state as anywhere else, if not way worse, jailing the former leader of the free world. But yeah, with all of that, Ukraine, a very not free country, continues to crack down on its Orthodox Christians.
Yeah, like the most dramatic news recently has been the local Kiev authorities, and I guess the Ministry of Culture has announced that the Church of the Tides and the Monastery of the Tides, which is a very small monastery, mind you, only has between 8 and 11 monks living there. So a very small monastery, a few structures, some living quarters, a mess hall. But essentially, the Church of the Tides is a very small chapel. It looks like a bit of like a turtle shell. The turtle shell sort of church, and it wouldn't have been significant if not for a major miracle which occurred in 2006. Mind you, this church was built in the 1990s and actually consecrated in 2006 for the first time by the previous metropolitan, not Onufri, his predecessor, Vladimir of Kiev. So Vladimir blessed this church, and it was actually blessed on Easter. So it was blessed on that Easter weekend, and there was an evening service, of course, the Holy Week right after Easter. As you all know, the altar doors are open in the church, and this is what the significance of this church. I'll kind of explain it real quick. In 2006, the Holy Week of Easter, the altar doors were all open, and people were standing in church preparing for the evening services. Is around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The priest was actually outside of the church, and suddenly there was a big Theotokos icon standing in the middle. Not significant. In fact, the Theotokos icon was written by an American iconographer from California in 1998. So it's not an ancient icon. It's a copy of the Theotokos Vladimir from from Russia, but essentially it was just an American icon which was later imported into Ukraine. A pretty big icon, nevertheless, but it was standing in the middle of the church, and suddenly the people waiting for the service to begin they saw a figure dressed in all white in a massive like white cloak glowing walking into the church through the front doors, and it was the Theotokos, the Mary Mother of God. And the priest was outside. He didn't see all this, but there was at least 30 people in the church actually standing there waiting for the service to begin. And the Theotokos walked down the middle through the western doors, down the middle towards the icon, then looked down, inspected the icon very carefully, and walked around the icon through the royal doors, and lifted her arms up in prayer, similar to what the priest does during the liturgy, and began to pray. And suddenly, as she lifted her arms up, everyone in the church, they felt what Saint Paisios described as when you do feel the presence of grace. For the first time, you witness a miracle, you feel completely broken by it. Everyone fell down, and they described it as just they were completely not crushed, but like they were there was so much humility. Everyone fell down on the ground. When they got up, everyone kind of fell down in prostration. When they got up, the Theotokos was gone, and no one really saw her leave. So, and they will describe it as if she was a real person, and like she had the presence of a real person, not like a ghost or an apparition of sorts, but she was there, glowing white cloak, walked into the church. Yeah, it's just an amazing miracle. This is 2006 in Kiev. So this is like as we have, people going to the cinemas or watching like Lord of the Rings and stuff, right? Like 2006, think about it. It's like a very like it was just like yesterday. People had mobile phones and stuff. So this is a regular Holy Week, and this is the first week after the church was consecrated, and why this matters, right? And of course, this icon later began to perform miracles. There was even miracles, lots of miracles associated with healing. So this particular icon that the Theotokos essentially blessed now is the main icon of this church. It's called it's the Church of the Tithes, but the reason it's called the Church of the Tithes anyway is because Saint Vladimir of Kiev allegedly built a massive cathedral on this spot out of his own personal. Essentially, it's like a tithe. He paid for it personally out of his personal purse when he was baptized 1,000 years ago in Russian history. But nevertheless, this church that the Theotokos appeared in is what the Zelensky government is trying to deconstruct right now, because they're saying, well, this little turtle shell church, it was a temporary structure to begin with. In ancient times, Vladimir of Kiev, the Ukrainian prince, he built a massive cathedral on this spot. We should deconstruct it and rebuild a massive cathedral, which was standing here before the Mongol horde invaded. So, which is true, but you can see the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine using this recent miracle, just attacking it completely, attacking or of course the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, attacking the fact that, well, this church in a way, like no one has heard of a miracle of this level occur like recently, at least in Kiev, Ukraine. And now the Ministry of Culture wants to deconstruct this little church and essentially dispel the entire monastery. It doesn't help with the fact that the monks are being accused of being pro-Russian as well. So the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture and just the authorities of Kiev are completely encroaching on just we've seen them encroach on relics, things of that nature. Like in fact, they've in the lower caves of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra monastery, which is next door to this monastery, they've announced that in order to actually enter into the lower caves, you now need to pay like a tourist fee, which is between 20 and 40 American dollars. And actually to venerate the relics of the hundreds of saints buried beneath the Kiev-Pechersk monastery, you do need to now pay a fee to the Ukrainian government. Like, this is crazy, completely absurd. Not that the Ukrainian people, I'm sure they can afford it. It's simply just that the hubris of actually, the usurious sort of inclinations there. I think we can all appreciate the level of, how they're making it difficult for people, local Ukrainians, local people of Kiev to actually participate in Orthodox worship and veneration. Quite degenerate. So that was probably the biggest story recently. Now, the church is still standing today, and maybe it'll be protected, but we hope that at least, if it's just really sad considering the miracle occurred not really long ago. So persecution has, of course, continued and does continue. I think that the other big story, of course, was Bishop Theodosius of the city of Cherkasy in the Cherkasy Oblast. And we're not going to leave Cherkasy Oblast too soon because there's another big event happening in the city of Uman as well. But the Bishop of Cherkasy is actually on house arrest officially. The Ukrainian government has said that he's not allowed to serve any liturgies or attend any services. He's being investigated for his anti-Ukrainian, anti-state agitation, right? So this is in the city of Cherkasy in western Ukraine, and in that same oblast, literally next door, a massive pilgrimage is taking place. So I think I think we should definitely break down what's happening in that particular region.
I was just going to say, as these churches are being persecuted that have, miracles on them, as bishops are being prevented from adequately I mean, we just, on the new calendar, we just celebrated the feast of the exaltation of the cross that'll be coming up. On the old calendar where they are in, well, the schismatics, of course, they're already on the new calendar, so they've probably already pretended to celebrate, and now the canonical church will have to celebrate these feasts, and many of these hierarchs won't be able to. But unlike, the persecuted Christians, other groups of people are roaming the streets of Ukraine in cities like Uman and the Cherkasy region and these things. And these are, I mean, people may have seen, these are Hasidic Jews celebrating certain, actually I need to, I'll look up the specific details really quick, but they were flying into Chisinau in Moldova. And because none of these flights were able to come from Israel to Ukraine, and they then went on buses from Chisinau into Ukraine, into these cities. And I think, Dimitri, while I pull up some of these details, you can fill us in on a bit of what the history is behind what's going on there.
Yeah, so the city of Uman, or at least back in the day, was more of a town. Essentially, it still is a bit of a town. It has an ancient Jewish Hasidic Jewish graveyard. In fact, it is considered the capital city of Hasidism. This particular very Orthodox Jewish, not in a Christian way, but very Orthodox sect of Jews, where they practice very strict, or alleged post New Testament Orthodox, Babylonian Jewish religion there. And of course, this is a very Eastern European phenomenon. So during the Pale settlement, I guess you can call it Russian imperial discrimination, the Jews really made their home in Uman for a very long time. In fact, there was a lot of them up north near Chernobyl, but definitely Uman in the south, in the Cherkasy region, that was the biggest hub. And to this day, I think it does have the most famous Jewish graveyard in all of Eastern Europe. Many of their famous rabbis, including some of the rabbis who they claimed they had these local prophecies about the Moshiach and their version of the Messiah coming forth. All those rabbis were, of course, buried at this graveyard. So there is this yearly, essentially this yearly pilgrimage which they make. Last year we didn't hear much about it because it definitely coincided with not just the Russian mobilization, but the strikes upon Kiev and some of those western regions. But I did read an article from 2022 where they, there was a missile, like one missile strike, I think, hit the outskirts of Uman, and somebody called it the. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but there was I think it was a Jerusalem Post Time or article, and they mentioned they called it like the Holocaust of Uman or something like. And the missile didn't even hit anyone; it hit like a farmhouse or something. And look, it's like the graveyard is very ancient. It goes back at least 500 years into the past, at least towards the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But nevertheless, we do have these, and Zelensky, we do have these Hasidic Jews en masse traveling from Israel, from various Western countries, particularly from Israel, from all those Orthodox Jewish communities, which, mind you, take land from Palestinians, which they're very famous for, from some of these settlements on the West Bank in nearby Gaza, things of that nature. So it's those particular people traveling to Ukraine, a war-torn country, mind you, a country which is experiencing a lot of strife, in order to celebrate their particular holiday in a diocese whose Orthodox bishop is currently on house arrest, not being allowed to serve a liturgy. It all aligns quite well, doesn't it? It's all very provocative, I think.
Yeah, and I got the details real quick. The specific branch of Hasidism that really makes the pilgrimage out to Uman is the Breslov branch of Hasidic Judaism, and they believe that Rebbe Nachman of Breslov is basically their founder, and they believe he's like the holiest. His teachings and his teachings, the rabbis that perpetuate them are, the truest expression of Judaism. And Nachman of Breslov is the great-grandson of Baal Shem Tov, who is the founder of Hasidism in general. I just think it's funny that the people that claim to be the people of the old book follow someone literally named Baal, like Baal, that's his name. But the symbolism is like there's never any, once these people started wearing the huge hats and identifying it that way, there was almost no need for any kind of, the symbolism is just that obvious thing, like they follow someone named Baal, is just a cherry on top for the fact that these people have clearly separated themselves from anything remotely akin to the true tradition of the Israel of the true God and Jesus Christ. But it's fascinating because, again, they all flew into Chisinau, took all these buses into Uman, trashed all the buses, of course, and now, like Dimitri said, they're dancing in the streets, they're celebrating. Again, Zelensky, the Jewish president of Ukraine. I mean, this is you really start to realize that that there are rich people that have had meetings and talked about, the specific region of Ukraine, with Uman being kind of the far northern part, all the way down to Odessa and down even into Zaporozhye, that this is like a kind of greater Israel. They want to turn this into like a second Jewish homeland, and it's the fact that it's just happening with the total support of all these like supposed Christians, and that this Zelensky stands in front of icons whenever he needs to rally people to die, but then when it's time to let people express their religion peacefully, it's these types, and then you're going to arrest peaceful nuns and others. So it's quite the dichotomy, and it does elucidate the broader civilizational conflict, which isn't even Russia versus the West. It's even deeper than that, and this specifically kind of shows all of that. But before we talk about some different rabbis in in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and we get into the conflict there, I want to talk about an interview that went on. I don't know the exact date on it. You could probably correct me, Dmitry, but Gabriel Doroshin, our favorite heir to the throne of Imperial Russia, has been very outspoken about what he thinks about what should happen in Russia itself. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there was an amazing interview, of course. Like, we've mentioned Gabriel Doroshin before in some of our Telegram and Twitter posts, and I even spoke about him on the podcast. But essentially, he's 7 or 8 generations removed great grandson of Emperor Nicholas I. So this is Emperor Nicholas I, who reigned from 1825 until 1855, and who passed away during the Crimean War. So essentially, a descendant of the Romanov dynasty directly through his mother's line. And Gabriel grew up in France. Actually, he's 26 or 27 years old now, and he grew up in France in the sort of Russian Orthodox Rocourt community there in Paris. And he's actually a local Parisian, in fact. So he grew up speaking bilingually both French and Russian. His Russian is quite good considering he never lived in Russia itself. But in when he turned 18, actually, his 18th birthday coincided with the beginning of the Donbass War. So in 2014, he traveled to the Donbass, and he actually fought as a volunteer between 2014 and 2017. After that, of course, after the Minsk Accords kind of settled things down, so to speak, and some of the Russian commanders disappeared, and the conflict really became kind of flat and stale, he traveled back to France only because he found it very difficult in the Donetsk region to actually make a living. So he traveled back to France, and at the beginning of the SMO, Gabriel returned back to Donetsk, Lugansk, reconnected with some of his old comrades, and has served on the front lines for a year and a half now continuously, which is very admirable for somebody from a pretty not even an affluent family. In fact, in the interview, he does mention the fact that his family, he had no other familial connections to the Romanovs, in terms of like he was never invited to any of the banquets, and the official Romanov House representatives, they've openly stated that they do not recognize him as heir to the throne. But funny enough, so he's extremely, let's just cut to the chase here. Gabriel is extremely based because, of course, the interview was 3 hours long, and it was recorded, I believe, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, but it definitely took them a while to release it. And in the interview, he speaks about the fact that, well, Strelkov should be free, Ukraine doesn't exist, it's not a historical entity. He says that, like, it just cuts to the chase of a lot of these massive subjects, and they ask him all kinds of really, you could say, on-point questions. For example, well, would you make abortion illegal? He's like, absolutely, abortion should be completely illegal. It is, the murder of children, and there should be education around it too, especially women should understand, women and men and things like that. He says, well, and they're like, well, what do we do? Do we increase contraception? He's like, no, just premarital sex should just not take place. Like, so he made like open, very Christian statements, which you could hear a local priest say, and this young man who is has gone to church his entire life. He's an example of an actual proper cradle dox Orthodox Western Christian who has actually stayed on the right path for a long time. Now is actively participating in the conflict, supporting his people over there in Donetsk. And in fact, some of the other subjects he spoke about, well, they asked him historical questions like, well, what's your opinion of like Nicholas II? He says, well, he's a pious Tsar and he's a martyr. And then he mentions, funny enough, because Nicholas II is canonized in the main Russian church as a confessor, not as a martyr. And he mentions that no, he is a martyr because Nicholas II was martyred by Freemasons and them boys. And he says, well, them boys ritually killed him, our former Tsar, and he says because of that, he shouldn't be classified as a confessor, because confessorship kind of denotes the fact that you were killed by your own people, but he wasn't killed by his own people. He was suffering mainly under the influence of Freemasons and those particular people, that I've mentioned prior. So very interesting. This is Gabriel Doroshin's direct words, paraphrasing, and that transitions to the fact that he started speaking about this particular subject. He says that, well, they said, look, the interviewer said, well, look, we don't really support any of these strong discriminatory statements. He's like, no, that's okay. You just need to understand the fact that these people rejected God a long time ago. You can read about it in the Bible. And they said the blood is on us and on our people. His blood, speaking about the Messiah. And Yeah, so he went really into detail on all of that. And funny thing, of course, him being the descendant of the Romanovs, Conrad, the subject came up. It's like, well, do you look forward to the restoration of the monarchy? And he says, look, I don't have any legal claim to the throne whatsoever because, frankly, 8 generations removed, it's on my mother's side. Legally speaking, I'm not a descendant. But he says, look, if the Russian people call upon me to be a Tsar, I'll accept it. It's kind of like this very epic, to the point, almost like in a which is what we've been missing for a very long time. We're missing directness, and he just says, "Look, he's like, I don't believe it's Christian of me to fight for power or to fight for influence or anything. But if the Russian people do need a leader to lead them, I'll take that upon myself. And if the Russian people, if God selects me to rule." And if the Russian people come to me with this proposal similar to how they, ancient times came to Rurik, came to Fyodor Ivановich, came to all these rulers alongside the bishop and just said, look, God has chosen you to rule as the Tsar, similar to how the people of ancient Israel, and he makes this connection where, of course, it's very biblical, and it's funny that he knows all these details, because in the Bible, of course, when King Saul passes, dies in war, the people of Judea and Israel, of course, come to King David in order to proclaim him king. And in a similar way, in Russian history, the people of Russia, alongside their bishops, would approach the next heir to the throne and ask him, the next heir, to rule over them as the Tsar. And so he says that, well, look, that's potential if you guys ever want to do that. But in fact, he does have some critical statements about Russia too. So he mentions, well, because the interview is 3 hours long, so Gabriel goes into details about, well, him living in Donetsk and Lugansk at the moment, he says the big issue is nutrition. So he says that, look, the food in Russia, he says, is like not as good as what we have in France. So he says Russian nutritional standards should be. He went into on this tangent for about 10 minutes, speaking about like how Russians should be eating more protein and stuff like that. It was and should be eating less chemicals, because a lot of their food, of course, is produced on like cheap factories with a lot of chemical produce and things that preserve food for a long time. In Russia, he says that's a major issue. I was like, okay, that's kind of a niche subject, my man. And then he, of course, went into details about how, well, he believes the SMO there's definitely been some hiccups. And he mentioned the fact that, Yevgeny Prigozhin's death has definitely been, because he specifically fought under Bakhmut and Solidar. So that was his particular deployment over the last, I guess you can say, 12 months' time. So he was particularly assisting Wagner very much on the ground. So it was quite an interesting interview. Generally speaking, there are no negative sides to this young man. I mean, yes, he has grown up in France in the West, but similar to, even Bishop Savo of Zelenograd, for example, he's an immigrant too. He immigrated to Russia when he was a teenager, and now he's one of the leading bishops of Moscow, you can say. So there is this, like, I guess, big reunion of Russians actually born overseas who did later end up traveling to Russia and serving in some capacity. I think it's very admirable. And whether or not this discussion does lead down some sort of path of monarchy, I think it's still curious that God does grant us these I guess really cool and affluent examples of young Christian laymen who are willing to serve in the front lines, who we can somewhat follow, maybe like a future position of leadership. And the fact that he's well spoken, handsome, likable guy, it's a bit rare these days, I would say, because most of these people either end up dead or end up ostracized or maybe pushed to the side somewhat. So I think it was a wonderful interview. Unfortunately, not released in the English language yet. Maybe eventually they'll either dub it or add subtitles. And this, of course, big shout out to Obыкновенный Tsarism, which translates to Ordinary Tsarism. That is their YouTube channel. It's quite a big YouTube channel. It's just been kind of it was created during the SMO, and they have really great interviews, especially for Russian audiences, and interviewing Gabriel Doroshin. Yeah, definitely a highlight of the week.
No, I'm hoping as a low IQ non-polyglot, I'm hoping it can be subtitled or something. But Doroshin is such an interesting character to me, not just because we are nationalist, czarist, orthodox people on this show, but the fact that he fought in the Donbass, the fact that he comes from France, it's this kind of emergence of this. You don't just need a good leader, you need the emergence of a new national myth, like new stories to reinvigorate the population, to inspire them, new heroes to name their children after, and these sorts of things. And Doroshin, not only is his story amazing as a warrior, but he also, the story of how he met his wife. He met her when he came over to the Donbass in a small village, like in the zone where there was fighting happening, and he brings her back to France. But then they both move back to Russia. And so if this guy becomes the Tsar, it's kind of like a reverse situation with Tsar Nicholas and Empress Alexandra. The Donbass, the heartland wife, brings, in theory, he ends up coming from the West, just like Empress Alexandra came from, Germany, the UK. He comes from France. She unites him to the Russian people. She helped him get better at his Russian and everything like that. And now they have children together. So there's also, in theory, no crisis of legitimacy. We've proven that he can have children. So it's a very interesting character. In Russia, it's hard with especially people that were born. If anything, it may have helped that he was born outside of Russia because people his age and older born during the Soviet era have a lot of baggage that very much clashes with the emerging Orthodox ethos of Russian civilization right now. So pray for Gabriel Doroshin, pray for Holy Russia. We are here on the show, and it's a very encouraging thing. But he also even had the right take on Strelkov, who we're going to do a quick update on before we transition to Armenia-Azerbaijan. Strelkov, unfortunately, as they've said, the investigation into him has been extended to December 18th. So we were all anticipating a possible September release. That is not happening. Maybe we were a bit too, we were just too hopeful to be really white-pilled on the Strelkov arrest situation. But again, I do still think our analysis that it does have to do with very much impending and on the verge of being kind of unveiled Russian plans for both the coming rainy season and then the possible cold winter, where if the winter is cold enough, the offensive that we talked about coming likely in February could come even sooner. I'm wondering your thoughts on that, Dmitry.
Yeah, I think they're trying to keep Mr. Igor Strelkov under wraps in terms of keeping him preoccupied. They don't want his commentary to be getting out to the Russian public or even those surfing the interwebs on Telegram, which they cannot control because, as you remember, Telegram is one of those free apps. I suppose there are rumors that the FSB does have backdoor access to it. From the simultaneity, CIA and FBI have access to Facebook, but those are in fact just rumors. Nevertheless, Strelkov has posted his opinion very actively over the last few years, and he has become very critical now. Of course, him being imprisoned, the only real takes we get from him are very much controlled and under the influence of his lawyers. So, in fact, he has been silenced. It's just it's a real big shame considering the fact that what the prosecution is doing during this time while he's detained until December. They're scouring his social media, similar to how, of course, the FBI was scouring the media of the January Sixers. So this is a complete equivalent we can draw here, right? People essentially looking at the material, for example, posted by let's take some nationalist political commentator like a Nicholas Fuentes or an Alex Jones, right? It's just this cancellation type tactic which prosecutions and investigative agencies use in order to get people on based on what they've said or what they've written in the past. It's just very dirty, and the fact that the Russian law enforcement and the Department of Prosecution is resorting to this is quite disgusting. And it does remind us of the Soviet times, right? Because during the Soviet times, well, why did the majority of the priests and clergymen, why were they shot in the 1930s under the Stalinist regime in 1937, 38, even earlier in the early 30s? It's because they were allegedly, there was accusations brought up against them. They found books in their homes. It does kind of throwback to modern Ukrainian persecutions, of course, but it does. There's allegations were brought up against them, statements that they've made, and this is laymen as well as clergy. So the fact that they're not happy about some of Strelkov's statements, yeah, big deal. He should be frankly released, and Gabriel Doroshin had the correct take on this particular issue. Regardless of what your opinion of Strelkov is, the fact is that he is a person of integrity or Orthodox Christian integrity, and that's rare in today's day and age. And of course, also his imprisonment does kill that sort of, as you mentioned, that energy of Christian romanticism, which we've been missing pretty much in the West. It's been completely dead, but in Russia, it's been somewhat on and off missing since the 90s because all these various heroes of sorts have been either passing away or disappearing and things of that nature. But Christian romanticism does need to re-emerge in some capacity because, frankly, it's either Christian romanticism or it's the cold secular. No offense to Lavrov, but it's like the Lavrovian type, heroism, which, as we've seen in the Soviet Union, it doesn't lead anywhere. The country falls apart in the 90s. Nobody cares about it. There is no support for it. People like Yeltsin take over. It's completely like you cannot build a country without some of these legendary figures, some of these massive figures of popularity, whom Strelkov is. So, in fact, just this oppression of the right wing in Russia really needs to be put to an end, and this the order may need to come all the way from the top, frankly. So that's what we're hoping for. But yeah, very unfortunate news from him.
I couldn't agree more. We're getting about 50 minutes now, so let's move on to Armenia-Azerbaijan. We have some pretty dramatic reports coming out of Russian sources basically saying that Azerbaijan could move in at any time. I know last week we reported that Turkey had really threatened Iran. Apparently that was overzealous Armenian media trying to implicate Turkey. I think they made a few statements against Iran, but nothing so far as we're going to go to war with you. So, correction here, you heard it. But in general, obviously, again, it's one of these situations where I do ultimately stand with Armenia. I don't think Azeri, Azerbaijani people should. I don't want Muslims storming over Christians' borders. But I can't, from a diplomatic perspective, it's hard to stand with Armenia. Armenia doesn't even have the balls to diplomatically recognize the Artsakh Republic as independent, let alone part of Armenia. So claiming that Russia betrayed Artsakh, which is what Pashinyan is doing, and what his kind of cabal in Yerevan are trying to, the narrative they're trying to perpetuate, that's just not going to fly. And I don't think most Armenians go along with that. And in general, I mean, Armenians are all kind of being pressed on all sides. The Israelis have taken 25% of the Armenian quarter. We've talked about the kind of scummy backwards land lease taking processes where they go and squat and then they use their connections in the courts to get their lease issues messed with, and then eventually Israeli groups come in and they basically have reappropriated land, and the Armenians have a big quarter in the Christian section of Jerusalem, and they have access to the Holy Sepulchre, and they're marching in the streets against this, and Israelis are attacking them there too. So we know Israel and Azerbaijan are major allies there. So of course there's going to be some mutual hostility, but this comes at the same time. It kind of ties in with what we were talking about in Ukraine with the Hasidim going there from Chisinau and from Israel. There's the head rabbi, I guess, of the Azeri Jews in Georgia. He was speaking to an audience, I guess, a broad just a general audience addressing Armenians, saying that Armenia is an anti-Semitic country and that all Jews still living in Armenia need to flee and go to Azerbaijan and Georgia and all these sorts of things. And again, like we kind of, part of the big backdrop of our show is presenting that them boys, they have historical enemies, and Russians are kind of one of those main ones. That's a big focus of the show. Armenians are definitely a group of those people as well, especially based on their presence in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land, and just their proximity to Greater Israel. I mean, I think we've saw the finance minister a few months back have the Greater Israel sign on his lectern. I mean, Armenia is in that milieu, so it's very important. Yeah, this was the Sephardic rabbi Zamir Isayev, the chairman of the Georgian Sephardic community in Azerbaijan. So he's a Georgian Sephardic rabbi in Azerbaijan who says, "I urge Jews who remain in Armenia, in a country where you are threatened because other Jews in another country have a different opinion. It is simply dangerous to remain. I understand that you're under a lot of pressure to publicly speak out against the opinions of leading rabbis in Europe, Israel, and Muslim countries who are outraged by the use of the Holocaust theme by Armenian propaganda." Yeah, they hate Armenians talking about the Armenian genocide because they think it, denigrates the Holocaust. And they say, if at least one of your parents is Jewish and you have a birth certificate issued before 1991, contact me. I will help you move to Azerbaijan. Even in Israel, they directly state that Azerbaijan is one of the safest countries in the world for Jews. Don't wait until someone in Armenia decides to take out their hatred on you. So this guy is just using the ADL playbook on every Jewish person in Armenia, I guess. I don't even know how many Jews there are in Armenia. Probably not that many, if this is the rhetoric they get hit with. But he's doing the whole, like, I mean, it's just, they know how to do this. They really know how to whip these people up into a frenzy with the they invoke the Holocaust, they do all this, and it's the ADL as well. The ADL whips all these people in America, a very wealthy demographic, I might add, up in America about supposed hate and anti-Semitism on a website like X. And then suddenly, these nonprofits are publishing studies, and Elon is banning people based on a study that showed that 338 tweets got like 6,000 impressions. Therefore, anti-Semitism is a problem on the website. That should be, the fact that they even publish that data is so ridiculous. This kind of all ties in with the ban the ADL stuff, but we're getting a bit far-fetched from Armenia-Azerbaijan. But this just does show you that, Armenia, despite having basically betrayed Russia, trying to renege with the West, trying to work with France, trying to work with people, Pashinyan is calling Erdogan, he's trying to make this work, trying to not have all their territory lost while still somehow not siding with the Russians. I don't think that's possible, but it shows you that them boys don't care. I mean, Armenia is a historical enemy, so they're gonna put the pedal to the metal on this. They want to see their ally take Christian land, and these people, they're gonna even ask their people to get out of there, because I think if they had their way, the Israelis and the Azeris, they would go in scorched earth on Armenia, I think, and Turkey wouldn't just look the other way, they'd cheer them on.
Yeah, and we've seen, just more evidence of Israeli-Azerbaijani cooperation, which does show that Azerbaijan is one of the most, I guess, influential Middle Eastern countries in modern history, not just having ties with Russia, some of its neighbors in terms of diplomacy, Turkey, of course, and now with Iran as well. But let's just firstly speak about the fact that we've seen Israeli military cargo planes fly from Israel to Azerbaijan several times over the last few days, which of course harkens back to reports from early in the Second Karabakh War in 2020. This is just prior to COVID, in fact, that there were military planes seen, and you can imagine in order to get to Azerbaijan, you wouldn't need to fly through Armenia. So these planes do is they fly from Israel all around through Turkish airspace, of course, which is completely protected. As I guess these are allied states, in fact, and it flies all around the Caucasus, right through Georgia and into Baku, Azerbaijan, which is all the way on the Caspian coast. So it's quite a long journey, but these planes do deliver military aid from Israel, which is a very militarized country. It does have, similar to North Korea, it does have equipment to spare, and it does have supplies to spare to the Azerbaijani force. Now, Azerbaijan, you mentioned they are the top dogs in this argument. They've won the Second Karabakh War pre-COVID. They do have a battle-hardened army. There were some reforms in Armenia, so we're not sure exactly what kind of Armenia does receive aid from. I mean, they do continue to purchase Russian weapons, as does Azerbaijan. So Russia funds both sides like directly, but these are not there's not free assistance. This is economic, you can say, almost commercial like transactions here. So both sides purchase Russian equipment and weapons. In fact, Russia is a major exporter to both of them, and in fact, where this particularly could lead in terms of Russian relations, we're not too sure. Especially as we mentioned last week, with the peacekeepers still remaining in that particular Nagorno-Karabakh zone, at least 1,000 Russian peacekeepers there, maybe as many as 2,000. So how those peacekeepers, will they be pulled out if Azerbaijan does make a move? We're not too sure here. But yeah, definitely it's not looking too good for Armenia, both on the diplomatic end and on the military end, especially given it to how the last war concluded. Now, we also needed to keep in mind the recent meeting on September the 12th, actually. Defense ministers, deputies of sorts and generals from Iran, so Persia, met up in Baku with leaders of the Azerbaijani military, and they've discussed joint military exercises and defense exercises that they could carry out in the future. Training. This is not, of course, a defense treaty of any sort, or any defense alliance, but the fact that Iran, like we've mentioned this before, Azerbaijan and Iran, they do have these historical gripes, and now suddenly Azerbaijan has made friends of Iran, or at least has come to some sort of agreement. Possibly this is a precursor to an escalation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is essentially telling Iran, look, we don't want you guys involved. This is just a personal conflict between the two of us. I'm kind of simplifying it, but it could be something of that sort. And just the fact that Iran, maybe now the fact that they're being invited into BRICS, and there is a sort of time of prosperous capitalistic peace, you can say, on the horizon. Perhaps Iran just doesn't want to get involved right now in this Middle Eastern Gordian knot, and maybe just doesn't want to join in and get tied into this entire and in fact, do you really want to support Pashinyan, right? Like, I mean, this is not a really likable guy, nor his government in Yerevan, who, half the ministers were already sacked by him since the beginning of COVID. So it's not like this administration is really stalwart and strong. It's not really something I think the Persians would want to support long term. Again, not very good news, and I agree with you, Connor. We don't want to see like Muslim boots trample on even Armenian apostolic churches and monastery grounds, right, as they push deeper into Armenia. I mean, that's just not something I think anybody wants to see, in fact.
Yeah, I have zero good things to say about Pashinyan. I wouldn't really even be sad if he got the Gaddafi treatment outside of maybe a loose Christian sense. I mean, at this point, it seems that the Americans are training Armenian police to fight against rioting Armenians because, I mean, it seems that we've talked about this in the last episodes. Pashinyan totally neutered the Armenian military, kicked out all the most competent commanders because they were all, according to him, pro-Russian. And basically, if he hadn't done that, he would have already gotten cooed out by nationalists, and it would have been popularly supported. So that's part of why he's working so closely with the West, is they're giving him intelligence assets, and now they're apparently even training his, police force to crack down on his own people who are really not happy with him selling out the Russians and kicking them out because the Armenian people know. I mean, there was all sorts of reports at the line of contact and everything that even the Russians were not happy with the conduct of Azeri troops and understood kind of the dynamic on the ground. But that doesn't matter to Pashinyan. I'm sure he's getting rich off of all of this. Maybe somehow he thinks he can survive this and turn Armenia into a George shill country. But I'm not sure necessarily the Armenian people are going to have it, especially if he loses. Especially losing, Artsakh at all, let alone possible actual current Armenian territory.
Yeah, that's right. The outcome would be, of course, tragic for Armenia, given the fact that the Second War really didn't take much territory from them. In fact, the fact that Russian and Western peacekeepers were involved, or at least the West, diplomatically they were kind of calling for peace in this particular conflict, but Russia got involved directly. Russia is a bit too preoccupied. We aren't in 2020 anymore. And I'm not sure if Russia would even want to get involved. And this was one of the main accusations of Pashinyan siding with the West, was he was saying, well, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, it simply hasn't worked out. Russia needed to defend us. But yeah, it does come into it does kind of speak to the fact that, well, was Armenia attacked first by Azerbaijan? Who actually threw the first stone? And again, it's similar. It's not exactly cut in. It's not exactly legalistically to the letter here in terms of like, oh, is it an Article 5 type of moment for the CSTO? And frankly, let's be honest, the CSTO wasn't really a strong organization to begin with. In fact, countries like in Central Asia and Ukraine itself pulled out of it a little while ago. So it really didn't hold much. I doubt Pashinyan realistically actually depended on the CSTO agreement for much besides military joint exercises. So let's not kind of die for his rhetoric. But in terms of like them boys being involved in all this, we do understand Azerbaijan, friends of Turkey, friends of Israel, now of course mending ties with Iran. But this is only temporary, mind you. It's only a band-aid over some ancient lore, ancient wounds between the Persians and the Turkic people of the mountains. So it's not going to really settle it, I think, in this particular fallen world, especially given if you look at like if you even bring up Google Maps, given where Azerbaijan and Turkey and Iran stand, like long term, this territory is very much disputed. But let's just figure out the fact that them boys have been involved in this region for a very long time. We spoke about like Rothschild's influence in Caspian oil during the late Russian Empire, Alexander III putting an end to that. The fact that there are various communities going back to the Khazarian Khaganate, and you have Georgian Jews, you have Gorny Evreyi, which are mountain Jews. Well, and these are two communities which are actually opposed to one another. They never really cooperated. In fact, Gorny Evreyi are probably a remnant of the ancient Khazarians, whereas Georgian Jews are essentially local Jews living in the Georgian valleys, and they were very much integrated into high Georgian society to some point, given that Georgia is very Orthodox. But they did, in fact, you can say masquerade, and so there's all kinds of ties there. And of course, as you mentioned, the Armenian community may be a lot smaller, but in fact, the Azerbaijani rabbi is calling for them to leave. In fact, this sort of wartime World War II type rhetoric that you would see from like a sidekick of a Winston Churchill claiming that the Nazis have begun oppression against these people and it's time to call for a war of some sort. I mean, it's very rhetorical and it's very reminiscent of the public relations tactics we would see during the Second World War. So, and I'm not sure what kind of validity it would have given the fact that Pashinyan is probably not starting up any pogroms or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can hope that the Armenian people and the military is able to regain some sovereignty and get this goober out of there. But unfortunately, it seems, I mean, he staged a rally with like a few thousand fake supporters and Indian immigrants to make it look like he's popular. But I don't think anybody's buying it. It'd be better if the diaspora was more vocal against him because they're a lot bigger than the actual population of Armenia proper. But we know the Armenian diaspora, the most famous member of that is Kim Kardashian. So no offense to the good Armenians that feel terrible about what's happened in their country, but unfortunately it doesn't appear I'm wagering they just kind of lose in the next few months. Unfortunately, we'll be praying for peace in that region as well. But towards another region that is plagued with territorial irregularities and disputes, things have been kind of heating up in Srpska and in Kosovo. Just it seems that whenever something heats up in Srpska, Albin Kurti comes out and goes hard against the Serbs in Kosovo just to make up for it. But Srpska, Dodik, our favorite character, possibly our favorite head of state, despite being the head of a not recognized state, he never fails to impress. And he was indicted by a Bosnian court for going against, the integrity and the charter of Bosnia and Herzegovina and, the whole extensive, legalese that holds that coalition of Muslims, Catholics, and Orthodox people together. He's, been indicted. Obviously, I guess that means in theory he could be in trouble if he steps foot outside of Republika Srpska, because Republika Srpska itself already no longer recognizes the central court and Supreme Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So this indictment, according to them, effectively means nothing. But he not only, has kind of mocked the indictment, he even said that, this is a quote from Dodik, if he meaning Christian Schmidt, the European Union's the head of Bosnia and Herzegovina, from the, kind of the supervisor of the civilian government there, leading them into democracy, their European handler, their NATO handler. If he, Christian Schmidt, comes for a meeting to Republika Srpska, he will be kicked out. Dodik said, adding that in case the envoy transits through the territory, he will be given an escort that will make sure he leaves as soon as possible. So, I mean, I guess if this guy tries to enter what technically is territory that he has jurisdiction over, this would be a very interesting development. The Serbs in the region would be like, no, get out. Which, again, at what point is secession just a real thing that's happened on the ground? Again, there's going to be no legal recognition of Republika Srpska even by Serbia because it's playing this EU game. But for all intents and purposes, there's a country of a few hundred thousand, close, maybe even close to a million Serbs that basically just exists right now.
Yeah, that's right. And, the West has blamed Moscow's influence in the region, for example. Like, they've clearly stated that Moscow has backed Dodik, and this, in fact, could be Eastern meddling in the affairs of, like, an European nation. But, in fact, Russia does have this obligation against them in terms of international affairs to fight for not just Serbian independence, but Serbian, I guess, presence and cultural presence, which it did not do in the 90s. And in fact, to support them against, say, the Muslim majority, make sure that they're actually being heard and looked after in that particular area. But let's just be frank here. I think Dodik is keeping the tension very high on Bosnia and on that particular Balkan region. In fact, he's almost more of like a right wing leader of Serbs than, say, you could say Vucic is. So in fact, Dodik could even be seen. He could have political aspirations for himself in the future. And maybe if Republika Srpska is ever reunited with Greater Serbia, as it should historically, maybe we could see Dodik run for even the presidency of Serbia, or as perhaps maybe even as a prime minister of some sort. So I do think he definitely has aspirations of a higher kind. That's just we're not sure where. But he's playing this game very carefully. Notice he's not leaving Republika Srpska. He's not going to get himself. He knows there's indictments coming. There's probably maybe even warrants for his arrest coming. Right. So let's just expect this matter to escalate very slowly. But the tension is definitely very high in that particular region. And look, frankly, this is to the benefit of the local Serbs. They do need to understand that they have a say in how their particular region, their administrative region in Bosnia and Herzegovina is governed. Because look, since the 1995 and all those issues with the fall of Yugoslavia and the civil wars, the Serbians in Bosnia have been hit over the head with this hammer that, look, you guys are like the new Nazis. You've caused the genocide of the Bosnians. You are the bad guys. You do need to submit to us and submit to European values. And when that's just not the case, the modern generation of Serbians born after 1995, you can say, like, the Serbian Zoomers have no, or even the Serbian millennials were simply children when whatever happened took place in the 90s. They have no obligation to pay any sort of reparations to the Muslim Bosnians. In fact, if anything, they have to actually continue to hold strong to their particular cultural ties to Greater Serbia, their Orthodox traditions. They need to culturally sort of enrich themselves with their own heritage, and not kind of give it up, similar to what has been done to say Japan or Germany after the Second World War. So that's in fact what the West has been trying to push upon these Bosnian Serbians, but that's simply not the end goal here. And I think Dodik is a big representative, like essentially him coming from a boomer generation. It's quite good to see him stand up for essentially the rights of his future generations of Bosnian Serbs. I think he's kind of laying the groundwork for perhaps a future reunion of the people.
Croatia and Bosnia must shrink. Serbia will grow. Hail Dodik. Kosovo is Serbia. But regarding Kosovo, that's even almost just as big news. Is there was a proposal put forward in Brussels that would have, finally kind of solved the Kosovo-Serbia question, and it was rejected by Albin Kurti, the head of quote-unquote Kosovo. And it's really interesting, the specific articles of it that he rejected, the most important ones being the completion of negotiations for the statute of the self-management instrument for Serbs in Kosovo. That's obviously the biggest one that would, the Serbs, the majority Serbian areas of northern Kosovo would be able to have some kind of self-autonomy, self-governance, not be fully under the boot of a Muslim force. They had a problem with that. They had a problem with the formalization of the status of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Kosovo, fully giving, the patriarch the jurisprudence and the ability to travel freely as if he were in any other territory, Montenegro, Serbia, where he has his jurisdiction, Srpska. But, this just shows that this guy is a thug, and he knows that ultimately, even if the U.S. clamps down on him, the U.S. is fundamentally in favor of the independent Kosovo project, and he's popular among the Kosovar Albanians. So they're never really going to take him out unless it gets really, really bad. So he knows that he can just squeeze and squeeze and squeeze until Maybe he's hoping Dodik does something big in Bosnia so public opinion can turn against Serbs, so the West can whip up anti-Serb sentiment again and then be like, yeah, what? Yeah, the Serbs in Kosovo don't need autonomy. They can get up and leave and go to Serbia if they don't want to be there anymore. And we know that's nonsense. All of Kosovo is Serbia. The Muslims are the ones that need to leave. So it's very interesting. Obviously, we do not like Albin Kurti, and again, even the Westoids think he's a pain in the ass. So it's a tense situation. You know, you've got kind of the best of the best with Dodik and the worst of the worst with someone like Kurti, but we're obviously going to be watching it very closely. Unless you have anything else you want to say about that, Dimitri, I'm going to quickly tap the people in on what's going on in Italy with all the migrants, and then we'll give a few other updates on India, and then start to wrap this up.
Yeah, I think the situation in Italy is very, very much telling. So Italy was one of the Italian forces in Kosovo were actually holding the Muslim immigrant controlled areas and fighting back against Serbian aggression for a while now. And now finally Italy itself, of course, has been experiencing mass migration from Muslim countries in Northern Africa, and it's kind of telling that the fact that Italians do want a right wing leader but simply cannot obtain one. Meanwhile, Serbians are more or less, kind of even Vucic himself is rising up to the occasion. But while the Italian leaders are somewhat falling short, for example, like Meloni, as you mentioned, has completely betrayed all of her obligations to her electorate. Almost completely. So the Italian people voted for her specific type policies, her specific attitudes towards migration, and she has completely betrayed her own constituents, which I'm not sure what her plans are in life, but I don't think she's going to be re-elected after the sort of shows she's been putting on for the last few weeks. Given the fact that immigration hasn't really slowed down over the last few years of her being in office.
Oh, it's really terrible. And look, I'm not necessarily surprised, woman in politics, tale as old as time, right? But at the end of the day, you gotta pay attention to the political mechanism. Like I was paying attention to dissident right politics in Europe, kind of before it became even bigger to discuss, back in, 2015, 2016, 2017, when people like Salvini were rising up. And I mean, just to report what's on the ground real quick, the big news is that this town, Lampedusa, Italy, it's near Genoa. Sorry for Italians if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but basically it's a town of 6,000 people has now been swamped by over 8,000, in the past few days, 8,000 sub-Saharan African immigrants coming from the North African coast. Again, that's the thing. It's not like these are even just Arabs. These are just straight sub-Saharan Africans, most Muslims as well from Muslim countries like, Chad, Niger, Sudan, Nigeria. But they swamped this town. There's now more illegal black African immigrants than there are any kind of Italian. I think they even outnumber a lot of the tourists. And this is completely unsustainable. This is meanwhile headlines are coming out about how Giorgia Meloni learned to love migrants and like all this kind of nonsense. She's completely caved. She obviously is a huge Ukraine hawk, so no praises there. And it's just awful. I mean, we saw Salvini's meteoric rise in the face of just horrible, horrible left-wing governance. And unfortunately, he bears some guilt. He moved too early. He collapsed the coalition where he was the Ministry of the Interior in a coalition with the centrist five-star populist party, who, they had the prime ministership. He tried to move against them. They didn't have enough power. The five-star populists then did a coalition with the socialists, and there was a horrible left-wing government that limped along for a few months until, oh, who comes in? This new person on the scene, kind of a reappropriated former, fascist party comes out, and now, oh, they're more popular, they're more traditional and everything, but it turns out, the people that had been in the trenches so long get boxed out of the leadership, and then Berlusconi died, he was friends with Putin, and so any pro-Russian elements were gone. And of course, now we have this horrible Meloni situation, who again, she betrays us on Ukraine. Oh, maybe she'll hold the line on immigration. Nope. Total failure. These entire towns have been completely overrun by sub-Saharan Africans. This is completely, I mean, Italians are getting insanely radicalized. That's the only positive thing coming out of this. I mean, in Italy, you talk to people are raving, people want Mussolini back, people are sick of Meloni, people, maybe they'll vote for her again just because she's not the left, but I don't see any reason why the true right, a coalition that would be explicitly calling her out from the right, wouldn't start to rise up. I think that's something big that we're going to be seeing. And it's unfortunate to see. Look, I love Italy. I've been there. It's a beautiful place. And to see it just be completely overrun by just something that is so preventable. You could stop this just with a little bit of political will, but it seems that political will doesn't exist. But, we're getting close to the end here. Going to move on to a few other issues. I want to talk about India. I think we may have mentioned this in the last episodes, but India is renaming itself, the civilization state of Bharat. And again, this kind of ties into some of the kind of anti-colonial third worldist stuff that we get into. So it's not like we're, cheering for India to reject its colonial past or something like that. But I think it's important that we recognize what's happening here, and this is India, totally emerging as a Hindu nationalist civilization state, which, that's not all entirely good. Muslims and Christians in India are facing persecution, there's no doubt about it. However, that is also being exploited by international groups to try to destabilize Modi's regime. Because look, regardless of what you think of him at all, I'm not enough of an expert on Indian politics to really praise Modi as much as some other people I know who know more do. But there's no doubt that the ability to kind of navigate a single political entity with over 1.4 billion people and the religious and ethnic and linguistic diversity that India has, and to form a national movement to maintain popularity and, to maintain your place in multipolarity as well, not necessarily angering the West too much, but also, not fully jumping in with BRICS like we've seen. They've really maintained their own independence. It just shows the power of wielding both a population that large and, it is a testament to Modi's statecraft. He's definitely, somewhat of a gifted politician. And it's very important that, we watch India because their relations with China are going to be critical in, what we believe will be the hotter eras of World War III that are to come. And we talk a lot about Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh, but what India is doing right now in changing its name to Bharat is really reasserting this Hindu nationalist civilization. This is something that comes from like the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas, and it's just a reassertion of the historical myths that you hear about with Krishna and Vishnu and Lord Indra and all these other characters you hear about. This is becoming the relevant mythos of India, and of course they are part of this as they use it as a decolonial thing. They signal against British occupation and whatnot, which of course is popular. But in general, India is very much facing pressure from the West. It might be one of the most targeted countries of Western intelligence and Western economic warfare right now because of their power to boost the Russian market with their energy consumption and just their relevant location on the world island. And we know that so much of this is a battle for that heartland, the battle for the world island. Alfred Mackinder, heartland theory, to control the world is control Eastern Europe, and then by an extension, the subcontinent becomes very important as well as it becomes so populated. I'm getting very broad and civilizational here, but in that same vein, I want to, this may be a first on the show. We don't usually talk about non-Christian prophecies, but I think it's relevant and it's interesting. There have been some discussions of kind of two overlapping prophecies, a Hindu prophecy about the Kalki avatar returning to India and kind of restoring Bharat that we're kind of hearing about, and that coincides with an Islamic prophecy supposedly from Ghazwa-e-Hind. I don't know who that is. It's just from a Muslim source. He warns of a pagan government coming to India and initiating mass killings of, quote unquote, people of the book, meaning Muslims. Muslims refer to Christians, Jews, and Muslims as people of the book, Abrahamic kind of idea. They believe that at the time the Mahdi will send his army for their protection, which means some kind of Muslim authority. I don't know what this would be in the prophecy, and then the pagan government will be, taken on. So I guess in theory there would be a war between, I guess, India and Pakistan, I guess would be the relevant Islamic country. Maybe Imran Khan emerges back into power after being arrested, and him and Modi have a Muslim nationalist versus Hindu nationalist war. This is all very interesting, except none of it sounds good for the Christians in India, who, of course, we are praying for and we are rooting for. But I don't know, Dimitri, do you have any thoughts on the situation in India?
Yeah, only that there are, of course, prophecies going back, speaking about the Muslims and the Hindus, but we do need to keep in mind it's like not all the time. We don't have to necessarily take a Duginist opinion on this, like a full Eurasianist, broad integrationist approach, for example. We don't need to really associate the figure of, let's just say, like a Dajjal with the Christian reference of the Antichrist, or maybe even like a Mahdi as like a Moshiach or like a Messiah type figure. These particular heroic or antagonistic figures in like Muslim eschatology don't necessarily align with exactly what the Christian views are necessarily. So we need to keep that in mind.
I totally agree. I think it's just interesting to notice as like it's kind of the same thing that's happening all over the world is, the secularization of society is moving away, and people, just like people in Russia are recognizing the prophecies of their saints and elders, people in India and Pakistan are doing the same to the point where it's becoming geopolitically relevant. It's not just around the fire in the tent. And of course, our contention is that only our prophets and our saints are going to be the ones that give you the accurate picture that if you follow them, you will actually, you can navigate the, these latter days properly. That's not to say that there may not be certain, you know, clerics and scholars in other communities that happen to get it correct, but systematically, of course, we know the full truth is in the Orthodox Church and in the living saints and the living tradition and the working of the Holy Spirit across all of Orthodoxy today, and I believe very much if you're going to be looking at the geopolitical spectrum of the world, it very much becomes something important that you can look at. We like to talk about it all on this show, but unless there's we're really getting to the end here. There's big discourse on Twitter with the ban the ADL stuff is still going on, and even more so, people like Lauren Chen, like very normie conservative tier people, are very much. They're not just noticing the ADL connection. Basically everybody on the right had to disavow the ADL, and that was pretty easy because the ADL is aligned even against right-wing Zionist groups. But even more so than that, people are realizing even in Israel itself, religious Jews, these would be right-wing people, they spit on Christians. If you try to evangelize to anybody, they will spit on you. They will drive you out, especially in the old city, anywhere near the temple or the Dome of the Rock or anything like that. They will very much drive you away. And of course, even in Israel, we've talked about it before, it's illegal to proselytize to minors. And it's so funny that there was a video of, this bunch of Hasidic children spitting on and chasing and hitting, these ladies that I guess were trying to preach the gospel to them. I think they were Protestants. And Christians were rightfully getting outraged in America, conservatives. And the response was, actually, it's illegal what they're doing. So you really, and like, I responded, I was like, as if that somehow makes it better. Let's somehow, religious persecution happening. Oh, don't worry. Actually, proselytizing that religion is against the law. So therefore it's okay. What? Like, what's I guess the chutzpah, as you might say.
No, absolutely, and I think the majority of these conversations they do tend to like kind of we do discuss legality quite a lot, and not all laws, of course, are made in the right spirit, so to speak. So we do have to side with the Protestants here. I think they're definitely in the right, and whatever abuse is ongoing over there, it does need to be put to an end because look, we may be next in line. Frankly, like it's kind of like they came for them first, and now, I mean, we've already seen abuse, of course, towards Orthodox Christians in those particular areas. So it's not like it's unprecedented, but definitely pretty staggering footage.
The Orthodox get some of the worst abuse because we're some of the most visible, even more than the Catholics. We still have more of our, not to be simplistic, full regalia. We have more of that going on than even a lot of the other groups. You've seen, Catholic nuns have been spat on. The doors of Orthodox churches are spat on. We saw, Zionist extremists attacking priests during the liturgy at the tomb of the Theotokos. In Bethlehem, they do this as well, at the place of the birth of Christ. I mean, I think the main takeaway is that if we lived in a Christian country, if we lived in a country, even if it was controlled by just white Anglo-Saxon Protestants like it was in the past, we would hear about this. The institutions that cover the news, that proliferate information, would talk about this. But no, we live in a country and we live in a society and a civilization in the West where any kind of relevant cultural conversation about anything controversial is entirely controlled by them boys. So that's why I take shows like this to kind of connect the dots every week. We bring you a sort of little bit throughout all of it. We always bring you that little bit of a report on what they're up to and what is going on in the Holy Land and how are our people doing in the Holy Land, because we know the Antichrist may rule from there, but we also know that there will always be a remnant. There will always be true believers, even in the city of Jerusalem at the time of Antichrist. So it's always something important to the Christian heart. But with all of that, unless you have any final comments, Dimitri, I think it's about time to wrap it up. This has been a great episode.
No, yeah, thank you for speaking about such relevant subjects. I think definitely like the listeners will appreciate the fact that look, everything really does come together in a really nice mosaic, you can say, like an artwork of sorts, and it's just paying attention to various details across the you can say the years, the various books you read, but also just in the news. I think it's really important that people stay vigilant, keep following, and of course, as we say, always put the information you receive through certain filters, which will keep it, more or less, coming to you in a pure form without any of the extra baggage which some of these mainstream media websites could, of course, provide.
And with all that being said, worldwarnow.substack.com. That's where you find everything, our articles. If you subscribe, go paid, get behind the Ether Hour paywall. You get every episode of Ether Hour. We had a fantastic episode this week about Cornelia Zelea Cordrianu with our fantastic friend Momchilo Neveski. I think it's one of our best episodes, Dimitri. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think I'd recommend everybody go have a check it out. Definitely one of the most unique takes in the English language. I think nothing else really is available of that sort. So definitely, I recommend everybody check it out. The link will be provided in the description. So definitely hit that. Try the trial version. It's really worth it. I think. And big thank you to Momchilo, frankly, doing all the research. I would say for a historian to actually look into such a broad subject, it definitely goes a long way. And so kudos to him. I definitely recommend any of his works and whatever he publishes on the subject.
And that'll be linked below, of course. We want everybody to listen to it. There's a free preview, of course, on YouTube. But with all of that, World War Now _ on Twitter, World War Now Telly on Telegram. I'm on Twitter at GnomeRad. Dimitri is on Twitter at OCanonist. Follow us on Rumble, World War Now. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're getting close to 3,000 subscribers. Really want to get there. Leave us a comment. Leave us a comment on Substack. Like the videos, share the videos, do all that good stuff. And with all of that, I think I'll leave you with that. God bless.